Hello. This week's topic is campaigns, elections, and voting behavior. So please make sure you read Chapter 8 before you attempt the written question for the week. But I do want to give you a little background on the topics that are covered this week. So in the section on campaigns and elections, you're going to learn about the role, how modern campaigns operate, the role of money in American politics in the 21st century, the difference between different kinds of primaries. You'll also be reading about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is the process by which we elect our president. It is a controversial proposition because in some elections, as in 2016, the winning candidate in the Electoral College may end up being the one who actually lost the overall popular vote. Donald Trump, for example, did win the number of electoral votes he needed to become president, but he actually lost by about 3 million in the popular vote nationally. So make sure you read through that. A lot of times people have questions about the Electoral College, about why we have it. It is an institution that goes back to the founding of our republic with the establishment of the Constitution. And it was put in there because the founders of the country really didn't trust the idea of the people choosing the president directly. They wanted some kind of an institution kind of in between the people and the president. But today, the states do allow the voters to select the winner of their state. And so we do have the popular vote. It is a winner-take-all system, which means that whoever wins the largest number of votes in a state wins all of that state's electoral votes. So, for example, in Michigan in 2016, Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton by about 10,000 votes in our state, and he won all 16 of our electoral votes. But again, it is controversial when that happens. People say, why would the winner of the popular vote end up losing the election? But again, the framers of the Constitution set this up, so the only way to change it would be through an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The second part of the chapter deals with the right to vote. Sometimes we use the term suffrage or franchise. Both of those terms mean the same thing, the right to vote. Initially in our country, the right to vote was restricted to white male property owners, but that began to change in the 19th century. States did drop the property owning requirement in the early 1800s. And then just after the Civil War, Congress passed the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which extended voting rights to African American men and to those who had been slaves. Women did not yet have suffrage as of that time. For a period of time, African American men could vote in the South as a result of this amendment because it was enforced for several years. But eventually, the federal government stopped enforcing this right, and the southern states put up major obstacles in the form of the Jim Crow laws to deny voting rights to African Americans. Those included things like literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other complicated procedures that made it almost impossible for most African Americans to vote until the 1960s. And then in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which basically said the federal government would now enforce the right to vote for all people and ensure that states did not discriminate in their voting procedures. And until about 2013, that law was fully enforced and had been very successful in expanding the right to vote to people. In 2013, the Supreme Court did strike down a portion of the Voting Rights Act. So the portion that was struck down had made it more challenging for states that had discriminated in the past to try to change their voting laws. The idea was to have them go to the federal government for approval for any changes to their voting laws. But because of the Supreme Court's decision in 2013, states in the South and other places that discriminated up until the 60s do not have to get permission anymore from the federal government to change their voting laws. And so some people are concerned that that could bring back some of the problems that we had in the past. With regard to women, the right to vote was expanded through the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920. It said no state could deny someone the right to vote because of their gender. And then finally, in 1971, the 26th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted, which lowered the voting age to 18. So since 1971, almost all adults in this country have the right to vote. We have what's known as universal suffrage, all adults having the right to vote. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago the issue of the Voting Rights Act and how a portion of it was struck down a few years ago. Since that portion of the law was struck down, a number of states in the country, particularly in the South, but in other parts of the country as well, have passed voter identification laws. These laws require that anyone who shows up to vote have a government-issued identification card in order to vote. The argument for that is that it reduces fraud. The argument against that is that you have to pay money in order to get a voter identification card. And in some cases, if you're older and you don't drive anymore, you have no need for, say, a driver's license. And if you're very low income, you just simply might not be able to afford the card. And that becomes an example of maybe like a poll tax that we used to have, where you had to pay in order to vote. There's also another argument against the voter identification laws is that that very little, if any, voter fraud happens in this country. There are very isolated examples here and there of voter fraud happening, where somebody goes to the polls to impersonate a voter in order to cast a vote. But keep in mind that in order for that to work, you would have to have thousands of people engaged in that process, because that's the only way you really could change the results of any election. And the reality is that in any given year, there are only a handful of examples of voter fraud occurring in the United States. But again, one of the arguments in favor of having the voter ID laws was to cut down on voter fraud, but others would argue that voter ID laws are not needed because there is very little voter fraud going on. And another thing to consider is that because people make the comparison to having to show an ID when you go to the store, if you're going to write a check or maybe to purchase alcohol. But the issue with voting is that there's only one day or one series of days in which you could vote, and if you are turned away from the polls, it's not like you can come back and vote at a later date. So, and it's a basic right of our democracy. Whereas, say, buying something in a store, you could always return with identification or whatever you needed later, and you would still be able to purchase the item that you wanted to get. So. Again, there are discussions and debates about voter ID laws and whether they're necessary or not, but certainly this is something that has been in the news in recent months and years. Soon after he took office in January of 2017, President Trump appointed a voter fraud commission to investigate allegations of voter fraud. It does not appear that there really was any serious voter fraud happening domestically, although there certainly seems to be evidence that the Russian government was trying to interfere with our election process last year in 2016. So, in any event, just want to give you a little background on the topic. If you have any questions about voting or campaigns and elections or the Electoral College, please email me, and have a great week. Thanks.